December 18, 1944. Outside Krinkelt, Belgium. Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller pressed his eye against the commander's periscope of his Panther OSF. Scanning the snow-dusted ridgeline through the pre-dawn darkness. His tank, all 45 tons of sloped armor, and the deadly 75mm KWK 42 gun, idle with the deep rumble that marked Germany's most feared armored predator. Around him in the Ardennes forest, dozens more Panthers and Tiger IIs prepared for the opening moves of what the Führer promised would be Germany's greatest counteroffensive. Movement, 2 o'clock. His gunner, Unteroffizier Braun, reported quietly through the intercom. Müller adjusted his view. There, cresting the ridge in the growing light, came the unmistakable silhouette of an M4 Sherman. Then another. Then 5 more. The American tanks moved cautiously, their commanders visible in open hatches, breath steaming in the bitter cold. Müller felt his lips curl into something between a smile and a sneer. Shermans, he said, almost to himself. His crew knew that tone. They'd been fighting since Kursk, had seen the Americans in Normandy, and had learned to recognize easy prey. 7 of them. Braun, load armor piercing. We'll take the lead tank first, then work left to right. The Panther's loader slammed around into the breach with practiced efficiency. Müller watched the Shermans continue their advance, completely unaware that death watched them from the tree-line. He thought of the informal name German tankers had given the M4, Tommy Cooker. The Americans called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter. Lights first time, every time. Both names referenced the same fatal flaw. Shermans burned. Their gasoline engines and ammunition storage made them rolling funeral pyres when penetrated by German guns. Range, 800 meters, Braun called out. Müller watched the lead Sherman, probably a 75mm variant judging by the gun length. He'd studied the American tank thoroughly. Its frontal armor measured only 51mm at the hull, 76mm on the turret face. Impressive by 1942 standards. Laughable against his Panther's 80mm gun firing at nearly 1,000 meters per second. The Sherman's own 75mm gun couldn't penetrate his frontal armor beyond 500 meters, and even then only if the American gunner got lucky with angle and impact point. The numbers told a story of mismatch. The Panther weighed 45 tons to the Sherman's 33. Its sloped armor provided equivalent protection of 140mm at the glassy plate. Its engine, the temperamental but powerful Maybach HL-230, pushed 700 horsepower compared to the Sherman's 425. And that gun, that beautiful, long-barreled 75mm, could punch through any Allied tank from distances that rendered return fire impossible. On target, Braun said. Fire. The Panther rocked backward as the gun spoke. Müller watched the tracer arc across the distance in less than a second. The round struck the lead Sherman just below the turret ring. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tank seemed to hiccup, flame licking from every hatch and viewport. The commander, who'd been standing in his cupola, became a torch. The Sherman rolled forward another 10 meters before stopping, now burning with the characteristic fury that had earned it those grim nicknames. Traverse right, next target, Müller ordered, already watching the American response. It came exactly as expected. Confusion, panic, tanks reversing or attempting to scatter. Another Panther in his platoon fired, and a second Sherman erupted in flames. The Americans were trying to return fire now, muzzle flashes blooming from their guns, but the shells fell short or ricocheted harmlessly off German armor. They're running, his driver, Gefreiter Schmidt, observed with satisfaction. Müller watched 3 Shermans retreat over the ridge, leaving 2 burning hulks and 1 immobilized tank, whose crew was bailing out into the snow. 7 against 2 Panthers, and the Americans had lost 4 tanks without inflicting a scratch. This wasn't war, it was target practice. Pitiful, Braun muttered. How do the Americans expect to win with those things? It was a question Müller had heard variations of since Normandy. Every German tanker had stories. At Villers-Bocage, SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann had destroyed an entire British armored column, including multiple Shermans and Cromwells, in 15 minutes with a single Tiger. At Ericourt, though the Americans claimed victory, German tank crews reported kill ratios of 3 or 4 Shermans for every Panther lost. The math seemed simple. German tanks were superior in every measurable way. Muller had served in Panzerkampfwagen IVs in Russia before transitioning to the Panther. He'd seen Soviet T-34s. Those were dangerous tanks, well-armored and mobile, with a respectable 76mm gun. The T-34 had forced Germany to develop the Panther in the first place. But Shermans? They were mechanically reliable. He'd give them that. American tankers could count on their tanks starting every morning, which was more than could be said for German armor. But reliability meant nothing when you couldn't penetrate enemy armor, when a single hit turned your tank into a crematorium. Lieutenant, his radio operator called out. Hauptmann Steiner reports his Tigers have engaged enemy armor near Butkenbach. 12 Shermans destroyed, no losses. The radio crackled with similar reports as the offensive progressed. Panthers and Tigers were tearing through American tank battalions. Near Elsenborn Ridge, 5 Tigers had stopped an entire American armored division's advance. The pattern repeated across the Ardennes. Whenever German armor met American armor in direct combat, the Shermans died in droves. By noon, Muller's Panther had accounted for 11 confirmed Sherman kills. His crew moved through the snow-covered Belgian countryside like hunters who'd found a population of blind deer. Each engagement followed the same pattern. Spot the Shermans at distance, fire first, watch them burn. The Americans were brave. He'd give them that. They kept coming, kept trying to close the distance where their guns might be effective. But bravery without adequate equipment was just another word for suicide. Lieutenant, we're low on fuel, Schmidt reported from the driver's compartment. Maybe 60 kilometers left in the tanks. Muller grimaced. The Panther drank fuel like a man dying of thirst, barely 400 meters per liter on roads, worse cross-country. But that was a problem for later. Right now, he had a war to win. He thought back to his training on the Panther, the lectures from instructors who'd helped design the beast. The Panther OSV represented the pinnacle of German tank design evolution. Its sloped frontal armor wasn't just thick, it was angled at 55 degrees, causing most shells to ricochet harmlessly into the sky. The Americans had copied the concept from the Soviet T-34, but their implementation on the Sherman was half-hearted at best. The gun made all the difference. The 75mm KWK 42L/70, that L/70, meaning the barrel was 70 calibers long, could fire armor-piercing rounds that retained lethal penetration power past 2,000 meters. Muller had seen his gun punch through the frontal armor of a Churchill tank at 1,500 meters during training exercises. The Sherman's frontal armor might as well have been paper. Contact, 11 o'clock, 300 meters, Braun called urgently. Muller swung his periscope left and felt his stomach tighten. A Sherman had somehow gotten close, emerging from behind a stone farmhouse. But this wasn't a standard 75mm model. The gun barrel was longer, the muzzle brake distinctive. A 76mm Sherman, the Americans' answer to the Panther. Fire, Muller barked. The Sherman fired first. The impact against the Panther's frontal armor sounded like a giant hammer striking an anvil. Inside, the crew felt the shock through their feet and bones. Muller's vision blurred for a second, but when it cleared, he saw no penetration, no flame, no breach. The 76mm round had failed to pierce their armor. Braun's return shot hit the Sherman's turret. The American tank didn't explode. Not every hit caused the spectacular ammunition fires, but it stopped moving, smoke pouring from the hatches. A partial crew bailed out, running for the farmhouse. Good German steel, Schmidt said with relief. But Muller felt unease creeping in. The 76mm Sherman represented an improvement. Its gun could penetrate roughly 150 millimeters of vertical armor at 500 meters, enough to threaten a Panther side armor, possibly even the glacis plate at close range with a lucky shot. If the Americans were fielding more of these, if they got smarter about tactics. He pushed the thought aside. Even the improved Shermans were inferior. The numbers proved it. A Tiger Eye's 88mm gun could penetrate 165 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. A Tiger II, the Königstiger, boasted frontal armor exceeding 180 millimeters and a gun that could kill any Allied tank from 2 kilometers away. Just last week, Muller had witnessed a single Tiger II destroy 9 Shermans in a roadside ambush near Bastogne. The American tanks had frantically tried to flank, to find the Tiger's weaker side armor, But the German commander simply rotated his turret and picked them off one by one. The reports from other fronts told the same story. In Italy, a single Tiger, named Tiger 131 before its capture, had shrugged off dozens of Sherman rounds during one engagement. In Normandy, Hauptsturmführer Tiger had become a legend after destroying 27 Allied tanks in a single day. The technical superiority was undeniable, measurable, proven in blood and burning metal. By mid-afternoon, Muller's company had pushed 10 kilometers into American lines. Behind them lay the smoldering wrecks of 37 Sherman tanks. The offensive was succeeding beyond initial projections. German radio operators intercepted American communications, panic calls for reinforcements, reports of entire tank platoons annihilated, officers requesting permission to withdraw. "They're breaking." Hauptmann-Steiner's voice came over the radio. "We've cut through their armor like it's training cardboard. If we keep this pace, we'll reach the Meuse River by Christmas." Muller allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Perhaps this offensive would work. Perhaps the Americans would sue for peace once they realized their industrial might meant nothing when it produced inferior weapons. 1,000 Shermans couldn't defeat 100 Panthers if those Shermans couldn't penetrate Panther armor. But as twilight approached and his company prepared to lager for the night, Muller noticed something that troubled him. On the road behind them, they'd passed dozens of destroyed Shermans. But ahead, through his binoculars, he could see more American tanks moving into position. New ones. Fresh ones. Where were they all coming from? "Schmidt, how many Shermans have we destroyed today?" he asked. 11 confirmed for us, Lieutenant." The company claimed 43 total. "And yesterday?" 37. "The day before?" 28. Muller did the math in his head. Over 3 days, his company had destroyed more than 100 American tanks. Yet the Americans kept coming in undiminished numbers. It was as if each destroyed Sherman was instantly replaced by 2 more. How large were their reserves? "Probably pulling everything from Britain," Braun suggested when Muller voiced the question. "They must be emptying their depots." That made sense. It had to make sense. Because the alternative, that America could sustain these losses indefinitely, that their factories could replace 100 tanks as casually as a quartermaster replaced 100 mess kits, was unthinkable. As darkness fell, Muller's crew performed maintenance on their Panther. The final drive seals were leaking again, a chronic problem with the design. The engine needed an oil change, overdue by 200 kilometers, but oil was scarce. The gun's recoil mechanism showed signs of stress. These were minor issues, manageable, but they added up. A Panther required skilled mechanics and constant attention. Still, it was worth it for the combat superiority. Muller settled into his sleeping role beneath the tank's hull, listening to American artillery thunder in the distance. Tomorrow they'd advance again. Tomorrow they'd kill more Shermans. The technical superiority of German armor would carry the day. It had to, because if it didn't, if somehow quantity could triumph over quality, then everything Muller had believed about modern armored warfare was wrong. December 22, 1944. For days into the offensive, Muller's Panther sat motionless on a forest road, its engine silent not by choice, but by cruel mechanical reality. Schmidt lay underneath the hull, cursing with creative proficiency as he tried to repair the failed final drive, again. The same component that had been leaking 4 days ago had now seized completely, leaving 45 tons of sophisticated German engineering as useful as a stone monument. "How long?" Muller asked, knowing he wouldn't like the answer. 6 hours if we had the parts, Lieutenant. We don't have the parts." Schmidt emerged from beneath the tank, his face smeared with grease and frustration. "The bearing assembly is completely destroyed. We need a replacement from depot, or we need to cannibalize another Panther." Muller looked down the road where 2 other Panthers from his company sat disabled. One had thrown a track. The interleaved road wheel design that gave the Panther's superior cross-country performance also meant that frozen mud could jam the entire system. The other had suffered engine failure, the Maybach's delicate temperament finally giving out after being pushed beyond its operational limits. 3 Panthers, 3 of the most fearsome tanks in the world, defeated not by American guns, but by their own complexity. There, Braun pointed to a knocked-out Panther from another unit, victim of an artillery strike the previous day. "We can pull parts from that one." It took them 3 hours. 3 hours of back-breaking work in sub-zero temperatures, 3 hours during which they were vulnerable to American air attack, 3 hours that should have been spent advancing. When they finally got the Panther operational again, Muller checked his fuel gauge and felt his stomach sink. Less than a quarter tank remained, barely enough for 30 kilometers of road march. Fuel trucks are supposed to meet us at Lignaville, his radio operator reported. Hauptmann-Steiner says they're 2 hours behind schedule due to American air attacks on the supply route. 2 hours. 2 hours sitting stationary while the offensive momentum bled away. Muller watched a column of infantry march past, their faces hollow with cold and exhaustion. Many were teenage boys, 16, 17 years old, pressed into service as Germany scraped the bottom of its manpower reserves. They looked at the Panther with something like reverence. These boys who'd been told that German technical superiority would win the war. Muller climbed back into his tank and checked the ammunition count. 18 armor-piercing rounds remaining, down from the standard 82 they'd started with. They'd fired 64 times in 4 days and destroyed 73 American tanks. Some targets required multiple hits. Others were shared kills with other Panthers. A remarkable kill ratio by any measure. But those rounds couldn't be replaced here, in the field. They required factory production, specialized components, quality control that took time Germany no longer had. When the fuel trucks finally arrived, Muller learned they'd lost 3 tankers to American fighter bombers. The remaining trucks carried barely half their intended loads. His Panther received 300 liters instead of the 800 it needed for full operational range. Every tank in the company faced the same shortage. "Make it last," the supply sergeant said grimly. "Next resupply isn't scheduled for 3 days." 3 days. The Panther consumed fuel at a staggering rate, nearly 200 liters per 100 kilometers under combat conditions. 300 liters meant maybe 150 kilometers of range, and that was optimistic. Meanwhile, the Americans were falling back to prepared positions, forcing German armor to pursue cross-country, where fuel consumption doubled. As they prepared to advance again, Muller noticed something else troubling. A Tiger II from the neighboring battalion sat abandoned by the roadside, its massive bulk blocking half the narrow road. The crew had simply walked away from it. Muller pulled alongside and called to an infantry officer coordinating traffic. "What happened to the Tiger?" "Transmission failure," the officer replied with barely concealed disgust. "Third one this week in that battalion. Can't be repaired in the field. Engineers will have to come back with a recovery vehicle, if we have fuel to spare for recovery operations." Muller stared at the abandoned King Tiger. It represented the absolute pinnacle of German tank design. Frontal armor that no Allied gun could penetrate, an 88mm gun that could kill anything on Earth, 70 tons of Krupp steel, and German engineering excellence. And it sat there useless, betrayed by an overstressed transmission that had been a known weakness since the design phase. The Americans didn't build tanks like the King Tiger. They couldn't. Their factories lacked the precision machinery, their engineers lacked the sophistication. But American tanks started every morning. American tanks didn't need 6 hours of maintenance for every hour of combat. American tanks could be repaired by ordinary mechanics with ordinary tools. By late afternoon, Muller's company had advanced only 8 kilometers, compared to 20 kilometers the first day. Not because of American resistance, but because they'd lost more tanks to mechanical failure than to enemy fire. His battalion started the offensive with 42 Panthers. 29 remained operational. Of the 13 lost, 8 had been abandoned due to mechanical breakdowns or lack of fuel. "Lieutenant," radio message from division headquarters, his operator called. "All units are to consolidate and prepare for renewed offensive tomorrow. They're promising fuel and ammunition resupply tonight." Promises. Muller had heard many promises since 1939. He'd been promised air superiority over France and watched the Luftwaffe wither. He'd been promised victory in Russia and watched hundreds of thousands freeze to death outside Moscow. He'd been promised wonder weapons that would turn the tide, and seen precious resources wasted on experimental projects while frontline units went without basics. That evening, as his crew huddled around a small fire, Braun voiced what they were all thinking. "Lieutenant, have you noticed we're seeing the same American unit markings? That Sherman we killed this morning. It had the same divisional insignia as ones we destroyed 3 days ago." Muller had noticed. The Americans weren't just replacing their losses. They were replacing them fast enough to keep the same units in the line. How is that possible? Even if their factories worked around the clock, even if they had unlimited resources, the logistics of shipping replacement tanks from America to Europe should take weeks. They must have huge reserves staged in rear areas, Schmidt suggested. Probably been stockpiling for months. But that didn't fully explain it. Muller had captured American supply documents during the fighting in Normandy. He'd seen the requisition forms, the inventory lists. The Americans tracked everything with obsessive detail, and their supply chains moved with mechanical efficiency that German logistics officers could only dream of. When an American tank battalion lost tanks, replacement vehicles arrived within days, sometimes within hours, complete with trained crews, full ammunition loads, and topped-off fuel tanks. German replacement tanks came when they came, sometimes weeks late, often without proper spare parts, occasionally with green crews who'd never seen combat. The Panther next to Muller's had been waiting 6 weeks for a replacement transmission. The crew kept it running through mechanical improvisation and prayer. A runner arrived with dispatches from division. The promised fuel resupply had been delayed. American air attacks had destroyed 2 fuel columns. The ammunition trucks were stuck in traffic behind disabled vehicles. The renewed offensive would proceed, but units should conserve resources and maintain pressure through aggressive action. Conserve resources. Maintain pressure. Aggressive action. The words of commanders who were running out of everything except empty phrases. Muller looked at his Panther, at its thick armor and powerful gun, at the engineering excellence that made it superior to any American tank in direct combat. But that superiority meant nothing if the tank couldn't move, couldn't shoot, couldn't be repaired when it inevitably broke down under the stress of combat operations. For the first time since the offensive began, Muller felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. They were winning every battle and losing the war. Each destroyed Sherman was replaced. Each disabled Panther was permanent. The Americans could afford to trade 3 Shermans for 1 Panther, because they had 6 Shermans waiting to replace the 3 lost, while Germany had 0 Panthers waiting to replace the 1. January 3, 1945. Wiltz, Luxembourg. The offensive had stalled. Muller knew it. His crew knew it. Every German soldier from private to general knew it, though none would say it aloud. His Panther, now one of only 17 operational tanks remaining from his original 42-tank battalion, sat in a defensive position overlooking a valley road. They were no longer advancing. They were surviving. Through his commander's periscope, Muller watched an American supply column moving with the casual confidence of an army that owned the roads. Dozens of trucks, GMC 2.5-ton Deuce-and-a-halves, rolled past in organized intervals. Tank transporters carried Shermans. Fuel tankers, ammunition carriers. The column stretched beyond his sight line, disappearing into the winter haze. "Should we engage?" Braun asked, his hand resting on the gun's traverse wheel. Muller shook his head. "We have 11 armor-piercing rounds left. We save them for tanks, not trucks." The words tasted bitter. 2 weeks ago, he would have called in artillery or air support to destroy such a tempting target. Now German artillery was rationed to 5 shells per day per battery, and the Luftwaffe was a fading memory. What troubled Muller most wasn't the supply column itself. It was that this was the 3rd such column he'd observed in 2 days. The Americans were moving supplies forward at a rate that seemed physically impossible. Where were they getting it all? The answer lay across the Atlantic Ocean, in places Muller had barely heard of: Detroit, Michigan; Gary, Indiana; Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania; Cleveland, Ohio. Cities that had transformed themselves into the world's largest armory, while German tankers had been mocking the Sherman's inadequacies. If Muller could have seen Detroit's tank arsenal in that moment, he would have witnessed something that defied his understanding of industrial possibility. The Chrysler Corporation facility covered 113 acres under a single roof, the largest factory building in history. Inside, 23,000 workers operated 7,000 machine tools in 2 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They weren't just building tanks. They were manufacturing them with assembly line precision that reduced complex military vehicles to a series of repeatable steps. A Sherman tank contained roughly 8,000 parts. In German factories, skilled craftsmen assembled these components with precision attention to tolerances and specifications. Each Panther required approximately 150,000 man-hours to produce, from raw steel to finished tank. The Chrysler tank arsenal produced a complete Sherman every 2 hours. Not 2 hours of labor spread across weeks, 2 actual clock hours from start to finish. The math was staggering. 1 Sherman every 2 hours meant 12 Shermans per day. The Chrysler plant alone produced over 25,000 tanks during the war. But Chrysler was only one of several manufacturers. Ford's River Rouge plant produced thousands more. Fisher Body, Pacific Car and Foundry, Baldwin Locomotive Works, Federal Machine and Welder, American Locomotive Company, 11 major manufacturers, each running multiple shifts. At peak production in March 1943, American factories completed 2,464 Sherman tanks in a single month. That was more than Germany's total Panther production for the entire year. The numbers weren't just impressive. They were incomprehensible to a military mindset that still thought of tanks as precision weapons, individually crafted by skilled workers. The Americans had taken a different approach. They'd accepted that the Sherman was inferior in direct combat. They'd built it anyway, built it simpler, built it faster, built it in quantities that transformed industrial capacity into a weapon more devastating than any individual tank's gun. "Lieutenant, look," Schmidt said, pointing down the valley. Another column approached, this one carrying tanks. But these weren't traveling on transporters. They were moving under their own power. 20 Shermans in parade formation, their tracks chewing up the frozen road, exhaust fumes rising in the cold air. They weren't rushing into battle. They were simply driving to their assigned positions, confident that fuel would be available, that ammunition would be waiting, that if one broke down, another would replace it. Muller had traveled from Germany to Belgium, a distance of perhaps 500 kilometers, and watched his battalion shrink from fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and lack of spare parts. These American tanks had crossed an ocean. They'd been built in Detroit or Cleveland, loaded onto trains, transported to eastern seaports, loaded onto Liberty ships, sailed through U-boat-infested waters, unloaded in Britain or France, driven to forward depots, maintained, fueled, crewed, and sent into combat. All with a logistical efficiency that moved thousands of tons of war material as routinely as a German housewife moved groceries from market to kitchen. Behind those 20 Shermans were 20 more. And behind those, 20 more. In depots across Britain and France, thousands of replacement Shermans sat ready. Every destroyed tank was just an accounting entry, quickly balanced by another tank rolling off an assembly line in a city whose factories never stopped, never slowed, never ran out of steel or rubber or components. "They're not even trying to hide," Braun observed with confusion. "They know we're here. They must have spotted us." They had spotted the Panther. American reconnaissance aircraft had likely noted its position hours ago. But the column continued anyway because the Americans had done their own math. 1 Panther with 11 rounds wasn't worth rerouting an entire supply operation. If the Panther attacked, American doctrine called for the column to scatter, radio for support, and within 30 minutes, artillery, tank destroyers, and fighter bombers would reduce that Panther to smoking wreckage. The Americans could afford that exchange. Germany could not. Muller thought about the intelligence briefings he'd attended before the offensive. German intelligence estimated the Americans had approximately 1,500 tanks in the European theater. Those estimates were now clearly wrong, catastrophically wrong. The Americans had already lost more than 1,500 tanks in the Ardennes alone, yet their armored strength appeared undiminished. What Muller didn't know, couldn't know, was that by January 1945, over 49,500 Sherman tanks had been produced. Of those, roughly 15,000 were in the European theater or en route. Another 5,000 served in the Pacific. Thousands more sat in training facilities, maintenance depots, and reserve stockpiles. The Americans had built enough Shermans to lose 10 for every German tank destroyed and still maintain numerical superiority. Germany had produced approximately 6,000 Panthers total. About 2,000 remained operational on all fronts, Eastern, Western, and Italian. Tigers and King Tigers numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. Each one represented months of specialized labor, irreplaceable expertise, resources that couldn't be spared from elsewhere. That evening, Muller's company received orders to withdraw 15 kilometers to new defensive positions. Not a tactical repositioning, a retreat. The word wasn't used officially, but everyone understood what it meant. The Great Offensive had failed. Now came the grinding defensive warfare that would characterize Germany's final months. January 15, 1945. Near St. Vith, Belgium. The morning brought fog so thick Muller could barely see 50 meters. Perfect weather for defense. American fighter bombers couldn't fly in this soup. But the fog also meant he heard the Shermans before he saw them. The distinctive sound of their engines, 9-cylinder Continental radials, reliable as sunrise, came from multiple directions. Muller counted by sound alone. 6 from the north, maybe 8 from the east, more from the west. They were surrounding his position, not rushing in for a direct assault, but methodically establishing a perimeter. "They know we're here," Braun said unnecessarily. Of course they knew. American reconnaissance was thorough, systematic. They'd mapped every German position, noted every strong point, identified every Panther and Tiger. Now they were doing what they did best, applying overwhelming force to eliminate resistance piece by piece. The first Sherman appeared through the fog at 400 meters, hull down behind a stone wall. Muller recognized the long barrel of a 76mm gun. Before Braun could fire, 2 more Shermans emerged from different angles. Classic American doctrine, using numerical superiority to create crossfires that negated German armor advantages. Target left, fire. Muller commanded. The Panther's gun roared. The leftmost Sherman took the hit on its frontal slope and shuddered to a stop, smoke pouring from the engine deck. Not a catastrophic kill, but a mobility kill. Good enough. But before Braun could reload, all 3 remaining Shermans fired simultaneously. One round ricocheted off the Panther's mantlet with a sound like God's anvil. Another hit the glassy plate and deflected high. The third struck their right track, and Muller felt the entire tank lurch as the track separated. Track hit. "We're immobilized," Schmidt yelled from the driver's position. Immobilized. The word carried death sentence weight. A mobile Panther could fight or flee. An immobilized Panther was a stationary target for every American gun in range. Traverse right. Engaged at 76. Muller barked. Braun fired. Another Sherman died, its turret blown half off the hull ring. But now 4 more appeared through the fog, and these were different. Smaller, lower profiles, and moving fast. M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, mounting the same 76mm gun, but on a lighter, faster chassis. They split up, racing to flank positions where even the Panther's sloped armor couldn't save it. Left side, 2 Hellcats, 300 meters, the radio operator screamed. Muller knew they had seconds. The Hellcat's guns could penetrate his side armor at this range. Braun was already traversing, but they couldn't turn fast enough to engage multiple targets from multiple angles. "Abandon tank," Muller ordered. "Out, out, out." His crew didn't hesitate. They'd drilled this maneuver 100 times. Schmidt and the radio operator dropped through the floor hatches. Braun and the loader went up through the turret. Muller followed, grabbing the machine gun and a satchel of ammunition as he went. He hit the ground just as a 76mm round penetrated the Panther's side armor with a distinctive cracking sound. Then another. The tank didn't explode. The ammunition was stored low in the hull, protected, but smoke began pouring from every opening. His Panther, which had killed 91 American tanks in 6 weeks of combat, was done. Muller and his crew ran for a nearby tree line. Machine gun fire from the Shermans kicking up snow around their boots. They made it to cover and kept running, joining a stream of German infantry also falling back. Behind them, the Shermans didn't pursue. They didn't need to. They'd eliminated the Panther, which had been their objective. American doctrine didn't call for heroic charges or reckless pursuits, just methodical, systematic destruction of German combat power. Over the next week, Muller watched the American method play out repeatedly. They never sent a tank alone, never attacked without artillery preparation, never engaged without air support once the weather cleared. And most importantly, they never seemed to run out of tanks. His battalion was reassigned to defend a crossroads near Huffeleis. Muller, now without a tank, served as a forward observer for the remaining Panthers. On January 18th, he watched an American attack develop with textbook precision. First came the artillery, 30 minutes of systematic bombardment that forced German infantry into their bunkers. Then came fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts that dove through anti-aircraft fire to rocket any visible German armor. Only after artillery and air had suppressed defenses did the Shermans advance, but not in a mass charge. They moved in coordinated teams, 2 or 3 Shermans advancing while others provided covering fire, leapfrogging forward in bounds that limited exposure. The defending Panthers destroyed 8 Shermans that day, but 23 more reached their objectives. The Panthers ran out of ammunition or were forced to retreat before German positions were overrun. And the next day, the destroyed Shermans had been replaced. Muller watched recovery crews tow them away with the same casual efficiency they'd shown supplying forward units. Damaged tanks went to repair depots. Destroyed hulks were stripped for parts. Crews from destroyed tanks received new Shermans within 48 hours. German losses were permanent. When a Panther fell, that was one fewer Panther in the entire German army. Replacement tanks came in dribs and drabs. 3 here, 5 there. Never enough to restore units to full strength. Experienced crews were even harder to replace. Muller's battalion, which had started the offensive with 42 tanks and 210 trained tankers, now fielded 9 operational tanks crewed by a mix of veterans and teenagers who'd received 6 weeks of training instead of the standard 6 months. "It's like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket," Braun said one evening as they watched another American supply column roll past unmolested. "We kill 10, 20 comes. We knock out a dozen, 30 appears. Where the hell are they all coming from?" Muller didn't answer, but he finally understood. The Shermans weren't coming from warehouses or depots. They were coming from factories that never stopped. Every day, American assembly lines produced another 100 tanks. Every week, convoys brought another 1,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, spare parts. Every month, the American economy converted another $1 billion of industrial capacity into instruments of war. Germany's economy was collapsing. Factories were being bombed into rubble. Oil refineries in Ploiești were gone. Fuel production had dropped to trickles. The Ruhr industrial region was under constant air attack. Skilled workers were being drafted as the manpower crisis deepened. Transportation networks were shattered, making it difficult to move the reduced production that did exist. February 8, 1945, west of the Rhine River. Muller had been reassigned to a newly arrived Panther OSF. One of the last to roll out of German factories before Allied bombing reduced production to a near standstill. The tank smelled of fresh paint and cosmoline, and its crew consisted of himself, Braun, who'd survived with him, and 3 replacements who looked barely old enough to shave. The new loader, a boy named Hans who claimed to be 18 but was probably 16, had never seen combat. The radio operator had 2 weeks of training. The driver had experience, on tractors, not tanks. Muller had gone from commanding one of the most elite armored units in the Wehrmacht to babysitting children in a war that was already lost. "Contact, 12 o'clock, 800 meters, Braun reported. Multiple Shermans advancing in line. Muller counted 9 tanks moving across an open field in a formation that would have been suicide 6 months ago. But these Americans had learned. They moved with infantry support, half-tracks trailing behind. Artillery fire was already falling on suspected German positions. 2 P-47s circled overhead, ready to dive on any German armor that revealed itself. "Engage lead tank," Muller ordered. Braun fired. The lead Sherman took the hit on its frontal armor and stopped, smoke pouring out. The crew bailed immediately. American doctrine emphasized crew survival over tank preservation. Better to lose a tank than trained tankers. But the moment Muller's Panther fired, everything fell on them. Artillery shifted to their position. The remaining 8 Shermans maneuvered to flank. The P-47s rolled into attack dives, their distinctive silhouettes growing larger against the gray sky. "Reverse. Get us into cover," Muller shouted at the young driver. The boy panicked, stalling the engine. Precious seconds evaporated as he fumbled the restart procedure. A rocket from a P-47 struck 30 meters away, showering the Panther with frozen dirt and shrapnel. Machine gun rounds sparked off the turret armor. The engine finally caught. They lurched backward into a tree lean, just as 76mm rounds from multiple Shermans converged on their previous position. One shell clipped their engine deck, and warning indicators lit up across the driver's panel. "Engine temperature critical," the young driver yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "Oil pressure dropping." They'd been in combat for 90 seconds, and were already crippled. Muller made the calculation instantly. They could stay and die, or retreat and possibly save the tank and crew for another day. There was no honor in pointless death. Fall back to secondary position, he ordered. Maximum speed. The Panther limped away, trailing smoke, while 9 Shermans methodically advanced to occupy the ground they'd abandoned. The Americans didn't pursue the damaged German tank. Why would they? They owned the battlefield. Tom was on their side. That evening, Muller attended a meeting of company commanders at battalion headquarters, a farmhouse basement lit by candles because fuel for generators was reserved for critical operations. The battalion commander, Major Hoffman, looked 20 years older than his actual age of 38. "Gentlemen, our situation is straightforward," Hoffman said without preamble. "We have 14 operational tanks. The Americans opposite us have at least 80, possibly more. Intelligence reports they receive replacement tanks faster than we can destroy them." He let that sink in, then continued. "Our mission is to delay their advance to the Rhine. We are not expected to stop them. That's impossible with current resources. We delay. We trade space for time. And we do it efficiently." Efficient. A sterile word for calculated retreat, for accepting that every engagement would cost German tanks they couldn't replace, while inflicting losses the Americans would replace within days. New doctrine from Army Group, Hoffman continued. "We no longer engage enemy armor unless we have at least 3-to-1 superiority, 3 of our tanks for every one of theirs. We ambush, shoot, and displace before they can return fire effectively. No heroic last stands. No defending positions to the last tank." Muller understood the mathematics. A Panther could kill 3 or 4 Shermans in ideal conditions, from ambush, with good visibility, at range where German guns were effective and American guns were not. But ideal conditions rarely existed. Most combat happened at ranges where Sherman guns could penetrate Panther side armor. Most engagements involved air support and artillery that negated German armor advantages. And most importantly, the Americans had learned to avoid fair fights. "Question, Herr Major," a young lieutenant asked. "If we're only engaging with 3-to-1 superiority, and they have 80 tanks while we have 14, when do we ever engage?" Hoffman's expression answered the question before his words did. "Exactly, Lieutenant. We're not here to win battles. We're here to make them pay for every kilometer while the fatherland prepares other defenses." Other defenses? Muller knew what that meant. Nothing. There were no secret wonder weapons coming. No miraculous counteroffensive. No diplomatic solution. Just desperate old men in Berlin issuing increasingly delusional orders while the Reich burned. Over the next 3 weeks, Muller's company fought a dozen engagements. They destroyed 37 American tanks, a respectable tally by any measure. But those 37 destroyed Shermans were replaced within a week. Meanwhile, Muller's company's strength dropped from 14 tanks to 6. 3 lost to combat, 5 to mechanical failures that couldn't be repaired without parts that didn't exist. The American method was grinding and inexorable. They advanced with overwhelming force, accepted casualties that would have broken a German unit, and kept coming because the casualties didn't matter. For every American tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every American tanker killed, 3 fresh crews arrived from training centers in Texas or California or North Carolina. Muller captured an American tanker in late February, a sergeant from Ohio whose Sherman had thrown a track during an advance. The man seemed almost embarrassed to be captured, as if mechanical failure was more shameful than combat defeat. "How many tanks does your division have?" Muller asked during the initial interrogation. The sergeant shrugged. "Hell if I know. We started with maybe 200. Lost about 60 since December. Still got over 200. That's impossible. You can't have more tanks than you started with after losing 60. Replacements, Jerry. They show up every week like clockwork. Sometimes they bring so many the motor pool doesn't have space. We got Shermans parked in every barn from here to Paris." Muller dismissed this as exaggeration or psychological warfare. But 2 days later, his company observed an American tank depot during a reconnaissance patrol. Through binoculars, he counted over 100 Shermans in various stages of maintenance and preparation. This was just one depot, supporting one core sector. How many such depots existed across the entire front? The captured sergeant had mentioned something else during interrogation, something that stuck with Muller. "You guys build good tanks, no question. That Panther is a hell of a machine. But we build enough tanks. And enough beats good when you got the numbers we got. The American captain gestured to his men, who began searching Muller and his crew professionally, but without hostility. MPs arrived in a truck to process the prisoners. As they waited, Muller watched more Shermans roll past, an endless procession that seemed to have no beginning and no end. How many? Muller asked quietly. How many tanks did you build? The captain glanced at him. Shermans? I heard somewhere north of 50,000. Could be more by now. 50,000. The number was incomprehensible. Germany had produced 6,000 Panthers total and considered that a major industrial achievement. The Americans had built 50,000 of a single tank model, plus thousands of other variants, tank destroyers, and specialized vehicles. We mocked your Shermans, Muller said, almost to himself. Called them Ronsons. Tommy Cookers. Easy kills. Yeah, I know, the captain replied. And you were right. Tank for tank, the Panther's better. But we didn't need better tanks, Lieutenant. We needed enough tanks. And America? America's got enough of everything. As MPs loaded Muller and his crew onto a truck, he took one last look at his Panther. An American recovery crew was already approaching with a tank transporter. They'd haul it back to some depot, study it, strip it for intelligence, maybe put it in a museum someday as a curiosity. A relic of an army that had built magnificent weapons but lost the war of factories. The truck drove past the Rhine, crossed the pontoon bridge swaying under the weight of endless traffic, and headed west toward prisoner processing centers. Along every kilometer of road, Muller saw what the American captain had tried to explain. Not just tanks, but everything. Mountains of supply crates. Fuel dumps that stretched for acres. Ammunition stockpiles that could sustain armies for months. Field hospitals with more medical equipment than most German cities. Repair depots where damaged Shermans were being rebuilt on improvised assembly lines. This wasn't just military logistics. This was American industrial might turned into a weapon more devastating than any gun or bomb. Every factory in Detroit, every steel mill in Pittsburgh, every oil refinery in Texas had become part of a war machine that could absorb catastrophic losses and emerge stronger. In the back of the truck, young Hans asked the question they were all thinking. Sir, how did we ever think we could win? Muller closed his eyes. Because they believed in quality over quantity. Because they'd trusted in German engineering excellence. Because they'd mocked the Sherman as inferior without understanding that in modern industrial warfare, superiority came not from individual excellence, but from mass production, logistical efficiency, and the ability to sustain losses that would cripple any other nation. The Panthers and Tigers had been magnificent tanks, the best in the world, arguably. But magnificence didn't win wars when the enemy could field 10 adequate tanks for every magnificent one. 50,000 Shermans had rolled across Europe, and German tank crews had destroyed thousands of them. But there were always more. Always replacements. Always another Sherman cresting the ridge, another column on the road, another factory in America completing another dozen tanks while German production withered. We couldn't, Muller finally answered. We just didn't know it yet. The truck carried them west, past endless American supply lines, past tank parks holding hundreds of reserve Shermans, past a victory built not on superior weapons, but on the terrible mathematics of industrial warfare. The math that said quantity, when produced in sufficient excess, became its own form of quality. The math that said reliability and numbers could defeat sophistication and skill. The math that America had mastered while German tankers were still mocking the Sherman as a tin can. 50,000 tin cans had won the war.